All right, good morning. Anyone else agree with me that this time change sucks? Like, it's like the worst. I love the one in the fall where we get the extra hour, but I hate this one. Like, it's my kids last night, it was time for bed. It was still bright outside. So they were mad about that. And then this morning they didn't want to wake up because it was still dark outside. And I was like, I feel the same way. So I'm not a fan of this time change. So if we're all a little tired today, hopefully we'll recover by Wednesday, right? It's only 1 hour, but it seems to make a big difference for some reason. Anyway, I hope everyone is hanging in there. I'm going to talk about the second part of the paper, but I'm going to wait till the end. But I will talk about that a little bit today because it's coming up. Otherwise, I want to talk as well a little bit about our guest speaker that we had last time before we get back to where we left off with mood disorders and so on. But last time, and most of you were here, we had our guest speakers on suicide prevention with the QPR training. And I might ask you questions, at the very least, know what QPR stands for. What's the Q stand for? Question, Pete? Prevent? Close, right? Persuade, right? I know it's tricky, right? Because prevent in your mind, right? It makes so much sense, right? But persuade, and then what's the R? You want to remember? Want to guess? We'll help you if you get it. It is refer, you got it, right? So question, persuade, refer. And I know the P, it's so easy to want to say prevent, but it's a persuade, persuading them to go somewhere with you, and then referring them, getting them the services that they need. But I would love your feedback. I mean, what do you think? Was that helpful? Was it interesting? Was it, I mean, were any like general feedback at all? Did you enjoy it? I mean, it seems like an odd thing to ask with, it's not the easiest topic, but any comments or thoughts on their presentation? Between us, I won't share it with Jasmine. Is that it? Yeah.
Yeah, just in general as a whole, I found it very
Mhm.
because I like dealt with friends I knew online who struggled with like suicidal ideation
Sure.
and suicidal tendencies. And I never really knew what to do about that.
Yeah.
And I think but it was always kind of intimidating to me. Nothing I could say would ever seem to make things any better.
Mhm.
I was always scared that they were going to hurt themselves. And so the focus of the class, the focus of that class, that seminar, it was really something.
Nice.
How you handle a situation like that
Mhm.
in a way that does focus on referring the person to a source.
Yeah, and I think it takes a little bit of that pressure off of you as well. It's like, I'm gonna get you to someone who can help you. And
We don't want to trying to
right,
hear your suicide.
right. Because that's overwhelming, especially if you don't know someone, super well, or depending on the context you know them in. And I mean, there's nothing easy about suicidality, right? If someone in your life is suicidal, that's scary. It's sometimes it's hard to know how serious they are versus, just dropping it as like a mention. It's super tricky. I will say it was always my least favorite part about being a therapist because I would be so scared for my clients, right? If I had clients that were suicidal, like I would worry about them between sessions. Am I going to see you next week? And it was little things like we would make no suicide contracts. It's a thing that sometimes you do in therapy. You have them literally sign a form saying, I will not hurt myself or like commit suicide until I see you next. Right. And it seems silly to do, but sometimes that like signing it, that accountability was enough to keep people from doing it. Right. But getting them to resources and just worrying about, their health and if they were going to make it was probably my least favorite part of being a therapist, just because I was so nervous sometimes when you have people who are hurting. It's hard to think clearly when you're in a really depressed place or in a really hopeless place. And I always tended to overreact. I think my personal philosophy with kind of helping people who are in that frame of mind has been people will forgive me if I overreact and care too much, but can I forgive myself if I don't do enough? That's always kind of been the place that I've come at suicidality from. And I've never had anyone be like angry or anything like that. They said that no one will ever get mad at you. I'm not sure that's actually accurate. I've had people like get mad at me, not here, but like in other contexts. I've seen people get upset but it's usually because it can be a little bit overwhelming, and later they're typically quite grateful. But it isn't an easy topic. And again, I imagine a lot of you know someone who's either been suicidal or maybe even attempted or completed suicide. So I think it's really nice to have them in here and you get that little certificate. Please make sure that you put that on like an application or a resume. Anything you can do to help yourself stand out is going to be hopefully helpful in some way. But any other thoughts? Anything else about their presentation before we go back? I just want to make sure if you had any thoughts or comments. You got stuck doing the role play. Usually they run out of time, right? Usually they're a little more disorganized and they run out of time and you don't have to do it. So you got to do the role play, which I think is helpful, even if it's awkward. But hopefully you took something away from that. Again, make sure you know what that QPR stands for. I won't be covering chapter 7 since they did, so you make sure you look over those slides and anything that I have posted for it. But we'll jump back into this. There's obviously a huge correlation between mood disorders and suicidality. And if we go back, right, we ended here, we were talking about, biological explanations for depression. We talked about unipolar depression just on that one side. They emailed me later and said that you were impressive with your knowledge of symptoms. So I was very proud of all of you for that. Right. There have been semesters where I had to threaten to play that Bella clip again. So nice job. You didn't. I don't have to threaten that on you. But we talked a lot about these different biological explanations for that major depression. The biological treatments mainly center around medication, but there are some more intense treatments, but there are common ones that are called antidepressant drugs. And we started to introduce this, but then stopped here. These are medications that help alleviate or reduce symptoms of depression. Antidepressant drugs are an interesting group in that they're often used for a lot of different things. Obviously depression, but they can be used for anxiety, for OCD, for all sorts of other like disorders, with a lot of like atypical uses. And there are a ton of these, an absolute ton of different antidepressant drugs. And I imagine a lot of you know someone who is either on medication or has been on a medication. It can be a little bit tricky, right? Going on these medications can be a bit of a journey to find the right one in the right dosage or the right combination. But once you do, they can be very, very helpful for people in reducing some of those symptoms of depression. So they tend to fall into 4 main groups. I have a little video that introduces them. So I'll play this for you and then we'll talk about them a little bit more. Not the most like exciting video, but it's here. And I wrote some stuff on the board kind of echoing what he said and what's up here. And let's talk about them a little bit more. Let me turn this on. It's really wild. He mentioned serotonin syndrome on there. And I always used to have that like, oh, I didn't think anything of it, but I got serotonin syndrome. I feel like all proud of it. But it's so funny as a psychologist, it's like whenever you get to experience these things, there's always like a little bit of excitement because then you know about them. But it was actually quite scary. I was on, I forget which antidepressant to help with pain. I have what's called a trigeminal neuralgia. So I sometimes get pain like down the right side of my face and down the right side of my neck. And one of the atypical uses for antidepressants is to help with trigeminal neuralgia. And so I was taking an antidepressant, I think it was Wellbutrin, and I took cough medicine because I was sick, right? We were talking about being sick and COVID and whatnot. And apparently there's one cough medication that you can't take with Wellbutrin because they interact with each other in a way that creates serious problems. I did not know that this one cough medication was randomly the one that I took. And after 3 days of being on it, I woke up in the middle of the night and I didn't know where I was. And I was like hallucinating and terrified. I went to the emergency room and they thought I was on drugs. Like, it was wild. They asked me like 49 times what street drug I was on. And I'm like, cough medicine? Like, I don't know. I'm like, no, I felt it was so funny. I was like, I'm a teacher. I'm not on drugs, right? But they put in my chart that I was taking street drugs because they didn't know what it was. So the next time I went to my normal doctor, they're like, so we see you're on drugs? I'm like, no, like, turned out to be serotonin syndrome. It was ridiculous, but blood pressure, like 180 over 140. Like I literally was as close to like a seizure. It was intense from a cough medication, right? So I apparently am very sensitive to medication. I can't even take NyQuil. When I take NyQuil, I don't even know where I am. in the world, but it was wild, right? So I was taking is considered an SSRI, and sometimes they can interact with different drugs and medications to create problems like serotonin syndrome, which went away after about a week, right, as everything kind of left my system. And then I threw that cough medication away. I know better than to ever take it again, so that I don't end up in that situation. But these can have some pretty intense side effects that come with them. That one's not super common, but it can obviously happen, as I kind of learned the hard way a couple of years ago. But in general, we divide these up into 4 groups, starting from oldest to newest. And I wrote them up here in that way as well. The MAOIs, which we sometimes call the MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and that's spelled out up on the slide here. What these drugs do, and these are old drugs, these were developed in like the 1950s, right? So they're not really used anymore. But what they would do is they reduce an enzyme in your system called monoamine oxidase. And by reducing MAO, it then increases 3 neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So it has this really, really indirect effect, which creates a ton of side effects. In general, these 2 older groups are older and have more side effects because they're less direct. They're affecting quite a few different things rather than like being a little more selective or specific. And the most common one here is a drug called Nardil. It's not even used really anymore. Again, these were popular in like the 1950s, some of the first antidepressants. Then tricyclics or tricyclics, it's said both ways. They reduce a step, right? So they get rid of this MAO piece and they just increase serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. But because it still affects 3 of them, it has a very global effect, and they still tend to cause quite a bit of side effects. Elavil is the most common one here. Again, pretty rarely used. These were also like 1950s, 1960s, and 70s. Both of them together are older groups of drugs that are very, very uncommonly used. And yeah.
Just out of curiosity, were tricyclics or the uptake inhibitor, or they can do something with them, like drug synapse?
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, they all kind of work by preventing the reuptake of these different like neurotransmitters, but they work in a slightly different way than the selective ones do. But that's still the end result, right? Is that they're basically prohibiting that reuptake. So when 2 neurotransmitters communicate with each other, right, like the synapse is flooded with all of that, and then it gets reuptake back. And so all of them are kind of doing that. These ones do it a little more specifically. Yeah.
The SSRIs, are they then reached to the brain only or that serotonin receptors?
Oh, I mean, it's pretty much the brain that we're talking about, right? So all of this communication with your neurotransmitters occurs throughout the body, but what we're looking at is like this reuptake process is really being inhibited in the brain. Right. And so it creates more serotonin to therefore alleviate the depression. Right. But again, sometimes it can create too much, or it might not be enough, in which case we have to add other medications or consider like a different option. So as I mentioned, these 2 are old, right? Not even drugs that you probably have heard of very often, but these 2 are really, really commonly used: SSRIs and SNRIs. SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And they specifically or selectively work on serotonin, or SE as we sometimes abbreviate it as. But serotonin, which is a huge culprit in depression. And these are drugs that you've probably heard of, things like Prozac, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro. There's a ton of these, Wellbutrin, as I just mentioned. There's quite a few drugs that fall into the SSRI category. They're very commonly used, and they tend to have less side effects because they're newer and more selective. But this group of medications can just have a lot of side effects in general, like common stuff like stomach issues and headaches and dizziness and little things like that. But then they can also have more severe ones as well. But SSRIs are really common. And then SNRIs are another really common and newer group. These ones work in the same way, but they affect norepinephrine and serotonin. So sometimes, depending on the symptom profiles that people show, that might guide us as to which one we're going to pick. So remember that people can have like weight loss or weight gain, too much sleep or not enough sleep. So depending on that, that tends to kind of shape the norepinephrine piece versus just the serotonin piece. But unfortunately, it's a lot of trial and effort, like trial and error, right? Like, there's a lot of effort that goes into like figuring this out. And as some examples of here, Cymbalta, Effexor, Pristique, right? Again, all of the kind of newer ones fall into these two bottom categories. How many of you have known someone who's been on an antidepressant at some point? Or at least one antidepressant? Quite a few of you. Very rarely do you find the right one on the first time. And I hate to say that because it's kind of a sad thing to say. Someone who's depressed, they go to a psychiatrist or they go to a doctor and they put them on, let's say, an SSRI, right? And maybe it takes like 3 or 4 weeks to get you up to like a clinically significant dose before you know if it's working or not, and before you know if you can tolerate the side effects or not, right? And at that point, you might have to then take 3 or 4 weeks to go off of it to then try a new one where you go through the same process again. So it unfortunately can be a journey, right? But when people do find the right one, it can be really helpful. I mean, a lot of you raised your hand. Any like comments or like stories about people you know who've been on any of these medications? Is that almost a hand? Yeah.
Go off, and then I remember he just was super irritable,
Sure.
24/7 irritable, like nothing would happen and he's still be pissed off, like you're breathing too loud, and like I just.
You're sorry.
And then, which made him like dead.
Mhm.
It's like barely even moved, and then finally, like went through some other ones, and then he finally got on Lexapro, and now we're like, now it's like perfect.
Better.
Yeah. For
Yeah.
sure. So, because it really does deter you trying to find help. So like,
Yeah.
and
Right.
this is gonna work. So it's just, like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's really.
And thankfully, like you said, you got to one with Lexapro that does help. Some people aren't responsive to these medications at all, which we'll talk about next. But yeah, it really can be a like, well, this one makes you irritable and this one makes you too sleepy and this one makes you feel this. And like the side effects sometimes of these can be too much. And it's kind of become like a hobby of my partners and mine. Whenever we see commercials on TV for medications with the side effects, we just laugh at them, like listen to the side effects because they're so intense, and decide, would I rather have the side effects or the like primary issue? Because sometimes it really can make things so much worse until you find the right one, and then it makes it so much better. Other stories or thoughts? Anyone else? Experiences with these? Again, they can be incredibly helpful if you find the right one. And there are so many of them. There's not a way to tell which one to take. Like there's not like a blood test that you can take that says like, I'll do this one and it will work best. So it really is a lot of trial and error, and they have a lot of side effects, as I mentioned. I looked up just on YouTube, I typed in antidepressant, and the first commercial that came up was a Cymbalta one. So I want to play that for you. Cymbalta is an SNRI, tends to be one that isn't used first because it does have a little bit more intense like side effect profile. But I want you to pay attention to the side effects that they list. They are required by law to give you every side effect that is possible, just so that you know what is potentially possible when you take these medications. So let me play this commercial for you. And again, I just picked kind of one at random. You listen to that. It's just so many different things, right? So many different side effects. And those are really typical of any of these medications. And unfortunately, some people can't tolerate them, right? But they might be worse than the depression or make things worse. Really common in people who are younger to actually have their depression become more severe once they go on an antidepressant. And that's something that we tend to see in teenagers and children, which is why we try to avoid them in younger groups, right? As much as possible. So if somebody can't tolerate one of these, or maybe they're not helping, which can also be the case, people just don't respond very well, we can consider some other treatments for depression. And these are still biological treatments, but they are a step up for sure. Right. So these would be things that would almost never be a first line of defense. Like if you went into your doctor or psychiatrist, they wouldn't be like, okay, let's do some ECT as a way to start with like your depression. They would start with a medication, you would start with therapy. But if somebody wasn't responsive to those things, then you might consider one of these. And so these are for like either way more severe depression or depression that's unresponsive to medication, which again can sometimes happen. So we have like the old standby, and then we have some newer ones. And the old standby is electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. ECT is something that's been around for a long time. I showed you that clip from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest way back in week 1. And with this, what they do is they send an electrical current through the brain, causing you to have what's called a clonic seizure, where you lose consciousness for a matter of like 1 to 2 seconds. And in that 1 to 2 seconds, it's thought to like activate that Brodmann area 25, those different parts of the brain that are in charge of that brain circuit for depression. It's something that you would do over like 6 to 12 weeks. It's not a one session thing. It is like a multiple session kind of procedure. Someone has to drive you and take you there and back, even though it's outpatient, because it can be a little intense. It's pretty common that people have memory loss and some like side effects that come from it, but it's way more refined than it was in the past. I want to say it's shocking that it's still used. Is that a bad pun or a good pun? I don't know. Both. So bad it's good. But this is something that is still used, right? It's becoming a little bit outdated. It's being replaced by some newer things, but electroconvulsive therapy is still sometimes used for people who are unresponsive to medication. The next one, though, is the future, and it is really starting to like take off and become really effective and more available. TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, is a newer form of brain stimulation method, and it's way less invasive and really interesting. I'll share this with you. Like, as I mentioned, I have that trigeminal neuralgia. One of the like newer treatment methods for it is TMS. And like, I've been considering it. I was approved to do it. Like, if I want to start it in April, I've been approved to do it because I don't tend to respond well to medication. And I'm super sensitive, apparently, to serotonin syndrome. And so this is something that like I've been like researching a ton. I know a lot about it at the moment. And it's really wild. It's like this new procedure that's been around since the 80s, but it's finally starting to pick up some momentum, where you sit under like a magnetic coil and it sends targeted impulses to that Brodmann area 25 and 22 area parts of the brain. And it's thought to activate those parts of the brain that release serotonin without needing a medication to do so. So you bypass the medication piece and you're directly stimulating the brain. It's almost like they're using the type of energy from an MRI. And again, it's not a one-time procedure. It's something that you do 5 days a week for 6 to 8 weeks, right? And it's thought to be really helpful for depression. It has some like pain uses, as I just mentioned. And it's a lot safer than things like ECT. Now, it still has some side effects to it, most commonly like headaches and dizziness, but it's something that's gaining popularity. And until a few years ago, the reason that it wasn't overly popular is because it's ridiculously expensive. So for that like 5 to 6 week treatment cycle, it's upwards of $12,000. Right, so it was really restrictive for people, but now insurance companies are starting to support it for the first time because it has more efficacy than ECT. So really interesting. I'm on the line of debating it because I've taken so many medications for this like trigeminal neuralgia pain that haven't helped. And so they're like, well, you can try this, and they approved it, which I never in a million years thought would happen. But I have a little video so you can see what this looks like. But it's just a totally different procedure than what we saw with like ECT. And it has a lot of promise for people who are struggling with depression and haven't responded to medication. So let me play that for you. It's brief, but it gives you a little overview. Companies. So sometimes I feel like that means that they inflate their results a little bit. But in general, the idea there is that by giving those like targeted pulses, that it can activate that area of the brain in a different way. It can help alleviate depression. It does take some time, like not like 2 to 4 weeks before people generally start to see an improvement. And it can be that it takes it away permanently, or that it puts it into remission, and then you have to go back and do it again like a year or two later. So interesting, it's just a very like future promising thing that's starting to gain a lot of popularity. And we have quite a few places that offer it like locally. These two are much more invasive and are kind of like things that we don't tend to use very often, but they are mentioned in the book, so I put them up here. Vagus nerve stimulation, they put a little device that sends electrical pulses up your vagus nerve of your vagal nerve up the neck. It's operating on the whole like polyvagal theory of like activation of your nervous system. Really invasive because they have to put a pacemaker in. Same with deep brain stimulation or DBS. That's what's happening in that right image. They put two little devices right here in your chest and then little implants in your skull or in your brain. And they send pulses to that to activate it. Really invasive, really like kind of on the edge of being ethical for both of these. So they're not offered much, but the first two are offered quite a bit. And again, the second one here is really starting to gain quite a bit of popularity. Yeah.
This last two, does the patient have like control over how often their pulses or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different types of pacemakers that they can use for this. Like one of them is implanted, and so it's kind of operated from a device outside of the body. And then there's another one that almost like goes on your hip outside of the body and connects to it, and that one you can actually control yourself, which has some issues related to it as well of can that person like handle controlling that? Because sometimes you can adjust it yourself, gives you too much freedom, if that makes sense. So there's two different ways of doing this. This one isn't something that is hardly ever practiced. It's like mainly animal testing. But this one, you can have some control depending on the type of device that they give you. Right. So there's a couple of different options. Yeah.
So does electric convulsive therapy like?
Yeah, so I've never personally had it. My mom had it when she was younger for depression. And she said it was quite painful. She also tends to be a little dramatic, so I don't know, we'll see. But it can be painful. They usually give you a sedative because of that. So it used to be, if you remember that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest clip, they tied him down and held him down. So now what they do, because it causes you to have a seizure, your whole body shakes. But now what they tend to do is give you like a muscle relaxant or a sedative so that your body is limp and calm. And what that does is it prevents some of that harm, but it can be a little bit painful. The biggest thing that people experience though is memory loss, right? So oftentimes kind of complete lack of remembering of things in their life for a period of time over that like 6 to 12 week course of treatment can be pretty intense that way. Again, things to weigh, right? Like how severe is the depression and the suicidal risk versus, the outcomes of some of these potential procedures or medications or whatnot. I wanted to mention too, there's one other one that people typically ask about with ketamine therapy. That's another one that's a possibility when it comes to like medications. So ketamine, they give you this like low dose of what is like a dissociative anesthetic medication. Right. And so they administer this by a nasal spray. So they spray it up your nose. And it's a low dose of ketamine that creates like a subjective experience, right? It creates almost like a high or a trip of sorts. And it's thought in some way to create some positive changes, but it can also create other issues in that people then become dependent on the ketamine. You're replacing one drug with another. So it's kind of controversial, but that is another one that sometimes is used when people aren't responsive to more traditional types of medication. So lots of options in general, all of these are more severe, but we're trying to alleviate depression biologically. Any other like thoughts or questions about the biological stuff? There's a few cognitive ones as well, but anything else there? Another huge culprit for depression is the cognitive piece, right? Your thoughts. And a very famous cognitive psychologist named Aaron Beck created something called the Beck Depression Inventory, or the BDI. If you've ever gone to therapy and have depression, they often make you take the BDI to give you a score to see how you're doing and compare it like across sessions. But Beck talked about the cognitive triad, that when people have these three things in their mind or like mentally, that it tends to cause a lot of depression. His triad was a negative view of yourself, a negative view of the world and your experiences, and a negative view of the future. If you have all three of those, it tends to lead to depression. And so the automatic thoughts that are gonna come out of these mentalities are gonna create things like, that are gonna only fuel your depression. So for example, right, you're thinking about like this student example here. Let's say you take an exam in a class and you fail it. There might be a bunch of reasons why you failed that exam, right? You might have failed it because it was a bad test, or maybe you didn't study or prepare. It could be a variety or a combination of things. But if you had this cognitive triad, everything becomes about you and the world and your future related to that exam. And it's not uncommon to have a little of this, but if you have it in like a huge overblown way, it's going to lead to issues, right? So if you fail a test, you might have that like, I'm stupid. I knew I could never pass this class. I don't deserve to be in college. My parents think I'm stupid. My teacher thinks I'm stupid, right? It's like this kind of globalizing of it. And then it can go beyond that to like, I'm not going to pass this class. If I can't pass this class, I'm never going to graduate. If I never graduate, I won't have a degree, which means I won't get a good job, which means I won't have a lot of money, which means I'm never going to have a partner and I'm going to die alone. From one exam, right? It all just kind of spirals from there. And so a lot of his approach is trying to rein things in. Yeah, you failed a test. Maybe you failed a class. It doesn't mean your whole future is ruined because of this one thing, right? Or maybe you can do something to still bring your grade up and you just don't get the grade you want. So trying to kind of rein in those automatic thoughts, because when they spiral like that and one little event leads to these massive globalizations, it can definitely contribute to depression. So a lot of trying to change the automatic thoughts that people have to reduce some of that depressive thinking. So all of this has been just the depression side. From here, we can add mania into the mix. Right, so people can have only depression, and I don't mean it as in like that's not a lot, but like the depressive side only. Or they can have depression alternating with mania. And if that's the case, then we have what is called bipolar disorder. Used to be called manic depression, now it's called bipolar. So when people have bipolar disorder, they alternate between depressive episodes, which we just spent a bunch of time talking about, and normal mood, and then manic episodes. And during a manic episode, people are on the extreme up end of mood, right? Oftentimes not sleeping, right? There's a lot of different symptoms that can come with this. People don't sleep. They feel like grandiose about things. Like I can do anything, accomplish anything, oftentimes with no support or realism to those claims. They might have really poor judgment and planning, engage in reckless, impulsive activities that are dangerous or have a high potential for dangerous consequences. When people are in a manic episode, they tend to do things that cause consequences that they might pay for later. So the difficult thing with bipolar disorder is it can very much feel like two different people, right? Like I have this blue and red over here, two different sides. You have one person who's depressed, they never get out of bed, they're sleeping all the time, I can't do anything, I'm worthless. And then they cycle to a manic episode. They never sleep. They're up. They're moving a million miles a minute. I can accomplish everything in the world. It's just two very different people. And it can be kind of a challenging one to navigate in relationships and friendships and so on. Some of you nodding, right? And it can be very severe or it can be mild, right? It exists on a continuum like everything else. Any comments or thoughts or anything so far about this? I have a clip I'd like to play for you related to this, and then we'll talk about it a little more. But anything so far? Yeah.
Can it get worse if it's untreated?
Yeah, right. So over time, it could get worse or it could get better. Sometimes, people's bodies kind of mellow out or the circumstances contributing to it mellow out, but it can escalate if it's not treated as well, right? So it can go either way. It depends. Yeah.
Common for depression is spontaneously disappear.
I wouldn't say spontaneously, but it might ease over time, right? Sometimes people learn better ways of coping with their depression, on their own. And so then it just kind of minimizes and it's not such a big deal. It might be that someone takes a medication and it corrects their biology and they might not ever need it again. Or it could be something that stays their whole life. It's kind of a bunch of different courses that it can take. But to just randomly disappear, unfortunately not. It tends to be something that can stick with people throughout their life, or it could improve if it's circumstantial, right? If it's something that's more environmentally driven. Yeah.
So like I don't know how he had a gun, but there was a gun shot in the neighborhood, and then the ambulance came, and then like my mom was friends with his wife, and then she just told us all of that, and then it was kind of just concerning the fact that he like is capable of doing that, and he was trying to injure himself and his wife, so it's kind of a lot. So
Yeah. How scary, like during a manic episode or. Yeah. Yeah, people can get like really violent and angry. Yeah.
I just was not expecting.
Yeah. Well, that's the hard part, right? Because when people are in their normal like state, they can be calm and very typical. And then you get into a manic state and it's just like, whoa, what's going on?
Was a straight jacket, or he was just like tied down.
Sure. Wow.
Hospital or something.
Yeah. Definitely a risk to other people and himself at that point, right? Yeah. People can have very intense, severe manic episodes, or it could be much more like mellow, right? It can go either way. I'm sure several of you have seen the movie like Silver Linings Playbook. That main character is a really good example of someone struggling with bipolar disorder that goes in like a violent kind of a direction when he's in his manic episodes. I have a clip of that. And what I want you to notice in this clip is just, he has a lot of judgment of like throwing the book out the window, like that violent behavior as well. And he definitely struggles with that throughout the movie. But a lot of examples in his characters, a lot of characters in the media, like that are portrayed with bipolar disorder, but the manic episodes, we're adding them to the depressive episodes. So people can have like normal mood. So it could be kind of like where they have periods of up and down, and it kind of goes like this, right, over time, right? And so we're having these highs and lows with normal mood kind of in the middle, manic episodes thrown in. And there are two different types of bipolar disorder, because some people experience what's called hypomania instead of mania, right? And this is where something new was added a few years back. Bipolar 1 is the more severe. Right, so when people have bipolar 1, they have full-blown manic episodes and full-blown depressive episodes. So they have the extremes. It's more severe. The only difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 is in the mania, right? In bipolar 2, people still have the full-blown depressive episodes, but they have what is called hypomania or hypomanic episodes. And it's like mania light. Right, you have all those episodes or things that are related to mania, but it's not so destructive. A lot of artists and musicians and a lot of people have harnessed like hypomania to be very creative and productive. It tends to have a piece where it could be productive to it. Manic episodes are destructive. Most of the time people get themselves into trouble. But if people have hypomania, they might be able to harness that. They're sleeping less, they're more productive and doing more. It's less severe, but it's still considered a type of bipolar disorder. And just like with the depressive ones we talked about, there's something called cyclothymic disorder, where people have like low-grade depression and low-grade mania over a longer course of time. So a couple of different ways that this can present, with bipolar 1 being the more severe of the three. Any other like stories or thoughts or questions, comments about bipolar disorder? Anything else from your lives or comments or anything at all? Yeah.
I had this one patient, she came in and she started going nuts. And I already knew that she had bipolar.
Mm-hmm.
And she was just cussing and having a range in there. And then so when she goes to the doctor, by the time she got out, it was like her face switched. Super nice, saying sorry, trying to be helpful. And we're just kind of like, hey, you just kind of went from super angry to being super nice.
Yeah.
And at first I was like, wow, I couldn't believe how fast.
How fast they switched like that. And there are people that are called rapid cyclers, right? And when someone's a rapid cycler, they switch much quicker than is typical. But it's interesting with this disorder, and we'll talk about borderline personality disorder later in the semester, but bipolar and borderline are very commonly confused with each other. And people can have both, of course, but they share a lot of elements in common. Bipolar disorder is more like around mood versus borderline is like much more global. It's your whole personality. We'll talk about that more later. But that like kind of switching, intense switching reactive behavior, very typical of borderline. But it could also be typical of this if people are kind of a little bit more quick in the cycles that they go through. But it's one of the more stigmatized disorders. Bipolar disorder has a big stigma with it. So does borderline personality disorder. There was a hand over here somewhere. Did you have a? No, okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Like bipolar disorder, do like randomly like switches, or do they is there a specific like how do you call it?
Trigger.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oftentimes like when people are when they're stressed or there's a lot going on, it could trigger like a depressive or a manic episode. It can just kind of happen naturally on its own. But oftentimes it's life events that can kind of push somebody, or it could just be body chemistry and brain chemistry, which, is why we have so many medications. It's very chemically driven, but life events could easily push you one way or the other. Yeah.
Triggers. Not say to use my phone. I always know that if work's getting a little too hard.
Sure.
He tends to be hypomanic when he gets stressed out. And like you kind of have to like brace yourself. He usually does what he can. When stress starts becoming more apparent in life
Yeah.
situations. But I have seen it happen on its own naturally, but most of the time it's like something.
Yeah. Right. And if you've known someone a long time, whether it's a family member, a friend, or a partner, right? You start to learn their triggers a little bit, right? Like you said, like, oh, if work is getting really tough or school is getting really tough, you know that stress is likely to push them into like a manic or hypomanic episode or depressive episode. And so sometimes it helps when you know someone well. And other times it makes it so hard because you see the train about to go off the tracks and there's not much you can do sometimes. If it is something that's really like chemically driven. So yeah, it's a tough one for some people. This can be really, really challenging, not only for them, but for their people in their lives. Yeah. Sure. So a manic episode is 5 days, right? So a manic episode is shorter lasting than a depressive one, which is 2 weeks. So about 5 days is the minimum. They tend to be shorter because they're exhausting. It's almost like the body can't keep up with it. So it's usually like 5 to 7 days. And then people tend to kind of cycle out of it. That's the most common. Yeah.
Is it shorter or long? I would assume it'd be longer for a hypomanic episode, but it'd be shorter.
Oh, it can be the same, right? It's just less intense, right? So when, like if a manic episode was a 9 or a 10 intensity, it would be more like a 5 or a 6 intensity. People can often push their way through a manic or a hypomanic episode versus manic episodes are much tougher, but they are about the same duration. Yeah.
Like awareness to the fact that
Yeah, it depends on the person and the severity, right? Sometimes people are really aware of it. They're like, I'm in a manic episode, I'm sorry. People who have really good insight can actually, be aware of it and so on. Other times what happens is they're so blinded by the state that they're in that they're not able to see it, right? And that's honestly way harder to deal with, right? Because there's no owning of the episode you're in. So it really depends on how well functioning that person is, how much insight they have into their behavior. When people have had it longer, they tend to be better at seeing. But then they sometimes go so far into the manic episode that they're gone. Same with the depressive side, but much more common. Where was I at here? So causes of these, very similar to depression, right? We have the same neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and serotonin. and then dopamine to some extent. But with the neurotransmitters, now we have overactivity and underactivity, right? So when people are in a manic state, they have too much serotonin and norepinephrine. And if you ever listen to the side effect profiles of a lot of antidepressants, they will say may cause manic episodes, because sometimes what happens is it goes too far, right? If you have the dosage too high and you flood somebody with serotonin and norepinephrine and so on, right, it can cause manic episodes and cause bipolar disorder for the first time. Right now, if they go off the medication and it goes away, you wouldn't diagnose them with that, but medications can actually create manic episodes because they push your neurotransmitters too far. So over or underactivity, but then we add another one that's really interesting and unique to bipolar, and that's ion activity. So when our neurons communicate with each other, it's electrochemical in nature. The electrical piece is controlled by ions, and the chemical piece is controlled by neurotransmitters. And so what we get is that it's thought that something with like the ion activity might cause our neurons to fire too intensely or too stubbornly. And so we actually have medications that affect ions, like lithium, which we'll talk about in a minute, which are thought to play a role in this theory. So a little bit of like something new, ion activity, there's a couple of brain structures that are thought to be correlationally involved. And it's genetic, just like with depression, there is a genetic element to it. So most of the things that we talk about here are very like biologically driven, right? That people have an imbalance of neurotransmitters, something going on with their ion activity, and then maybe other things as well. So a lot of the treatments for this are very biologically driven as well. And we do something or use a group of drugs called mood stabilizers, right? So it might be that you take an antidepressant, but you might also take a mood stabilizing drug. And the goal with these is to bring the highs down and the lows up. I had to think about that in my head, right? So instead of this, you're hoping that you can get something a little bit more in the middle, right? Right, so bringing the highs down and the lows up. Sorry, I don't know what happened here. It was a rough patch right there. But you're trying to stabilize somebody's mood, right? Kind of get it to be a little more in the middle. And one of the most commonly used mood stabilizing drugs is lithium. Lithium is a metallic element, right? Any science people in here, you'll recognize that it's on the periodic table, right? It's a naturally occurring mineral salt, but it's also thought to be an effective treatment for bipolar disorder. What it does is it affects that ion activity and the firing of our neurons, but it's much more effective at treating mania than depression. So it's often not used alone. It's a very intense drug. You have to do blood tests when you're on it because it can be fatal if too much of it's in your system. It causes a lot of what are called Parkinsonian effects. People will get tremors when they're on it. They can't stop shaking. It's sometimes called akathisia, right? They just shake, right? And that can sometimes last even when the lithium is no longer in your system. So it's a very, very hard to tolerate drug, but it can be very effective at mellowing out, especially the highs of mania. It's so common to use something like a mood stabilizing drug, sometimes an antidepressant as well. Therapy, obviously, but therapy alone doesn't tend to be the most helpful for bipolar disorder. It's a more severe disorder, so it tends to typically be combined with like lithium or a different medication. There are other mood stabilizers as well, but that's the most common one by a mile. So it's pretty frequent that people who have bipolar disorder need to take some kind of medication to help mellow it out a little bit. As I mentioned, lithium, super interesting drug. A lot of songs have been written about lithium, right? And there's one that's way better, and I'm going to play it for you. Way better in terms of kind of describing the relationship with this drug. But Evanescence has a song about lithium. And the video, I think, is very visually descriptive of like the drowning and the pain and everything coming with it. But the words as well. So I'm going to play this for you. And it's interesting with songs. Like I hate and love this about music. You can take them in multiple ways. I'm a very concrete thinker. And so I'm like, what's it about? Tell me what it's about. My partner's an English teacher who thinks about everything like broadly and like, you know, in the right way, we'll say. And so it's interesting. You could take this whole song as being about the drug. Right? And if you look at it through that lens, it's really kind of an interesting, the lyrics are really more interesting. So here, I'll play it for you and just listen to the words as we go through. Pause this song, but some of the things she's saying are really interesting, like as it relates to the drug of, like I can't hold on to me, wanting to like get off of this drug, but wanting to stay on it. A lot of people, when they take this, talk about feeling super numb, right? Like it kind of just flattens you out completely. And like, as much as you hate that, it's also like helpful, right? And so kind of a love-hate relationship. And a lot of people develop that love-hate relationship with drugs like lithium, or maybe even an antidepressant, because it's helpful, but it might also completely change some things about you and make things harder, right? And so I think if you think about it that way, like, I don't want to forget how it feels without it, like not wanting to lose herself, but she couldn't handle who she was without it, right? And so it's really like, again, a lot of that love-hate, very popular. There's also other ones like Seroquel, and others that can work like Zyprexa, but this is by far the most common of all the mood stabilizing drugs. Lithium, difficult, but common. Any thoughts, comments, questions, thoughts, anything related to this? Anything else with mood disorders before we say goodbye to them? Wouldn't it be nice if we just say goodbye, right? Close it and they're gone, right? There's a famous like Saturday night skit that's like, just stop it, right? You're depressed, just stop it, right? If only that worked, right? Our next topic that we'll go to is actually eating disorders, which is chapter 9. So, we already did 8 and 7 with suicidality. So when I see you next, that's where we'll go. But I want to just take just a moment and talk about the second part of the paper. So if you're looking at the syllabus, the second part of the paper is due on Wednesday. I would like to give you a little extra time. Is anyone opposed to that?
No.
They're not opposed to that. All right. I don't know about you, but I woke up this morning like feeling like that felt too soon. And I just wanted to give you a little extra time. So I'm going to do that. I have that power. Why not? So let's go with next Wednesday. So I'm going to give you an extra week. I want it done before spring break because I want you to be able to enjoy your spring break. Okay. So that's something that like, I don't want to push it any later than that. But so I'm going to make it due. It was supposed to be due this Wednesday, the 13th. So it'll be due Wednesday, the 20th. Okay, so a little bit of extra time, 20 on Canvas by 11:59 p.m. So the second part of the paper is worth 40 points. So I just want to talk about it just for a minute before I still have a few minutes. It's worth 40 points. So I don't want you to not put effort into this. 40 points is a lot. That's 4 participations, right? It's almost half an exam. The biggest thing here is you're looking for a source that you're going to use to help support all of your information in the paper. And you're starting to get like an outline going. It can be in like a rough draft form of more like paragraphs. It can be bulleted. More than the formatting, I'm looking to see that you're making progress on your paper. I don't want you to be waiting till the last minute in April to write this. So that my goal with this second part is to have you get a source that you can use to support your assertions and that you're starting your paper. And every single one of you could use the DSM as your source. That would be a wonderful source to use. It needs to be something academic. So like a journal article, a book, the DSM. What I'd love for you to do in the next, ideally before Wednesday or maybe even on Wednesday, on Canvas, I posted a video that is a little like help from our library. And they go over how to access some of the library resources, including the DSM, and what an academic source is. So if you are interested or you're struggling a little bit with that idea, there's a video on there that the library made with me to kind of help with that. So I'd really recommend that you take a look at that. It's on Canvas under modules. But start thinking about this, right? So it's due next Wednesday now instead of this Wednesday, which hopefully will give you a little more time. And then you can shift and focus from there on our second exam in spring break. Was there a question? So our spring break is that first week of April, which is April 1st and 3rd. But I'm gone the whole week before that because it's coming up so fast. 12 days. I'm not counting it all. 12 days. It's in my like, when I check the weather, like at the end of the weather forecast, I won't be here. Right. So if you're looking at the syllabus, we have today and Wednesday, and then Monday and Wednesday. And then the following week on that first Monday, we have our second exam, which we wouldn't have had class anyway. So it's only one day, but that Wednesday, the 27th, like I won't be here, and then that following week is spring break, first week of April. So you get one extra day off for us, which benefits some of you, like for 2 classes, right? But otherwise, spring break is that first week of April. It's coming. I know everyone's ready for it. It's coming, right? Hang in there, it's coming. It's late. Everybody else gets it so much earlier. Ours is so late. But what that means is when we come back, we're almost done. So we'll look at it that way. Like we only have like a month when we come back. Crazy. Is that overwhelming? So,
No, that was.
so much time. I'm just kidding.
No, that's like a, holy cow, only 1 month left.
I know. We're past the halfway.
It felt like it's been moving slowly.
Yeah.
And I realized, well,
Right? Yeah, it's going quickly. And after spring break, it always goes really quick. So I'll stop there, but start thinking about that. Check out that resource on Canvas, and I'll see you on Wednesday.